Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Aligning Your Sales Compensation Plan to the Economy. I'm Michael Gandon, your moderator, but before we begin, I'd like to confirm that our audio is working properly. Please raise your hand to let me know if you can hear my voice today. Or you can also use chat as well. Perfect. Thank you for that check. If your control panel for GoToWebinar is minimized, please select the orange button with the white arrow pointing to the right to access all your tabs and functions that are available to you. We ask that you please close any unused browsers or any apps that could, or software that could take up bandwidth. You can communicate with your presenters today by using the questions tab. Please use this option for any content related questions you might have or if you experience any technical difficulties. Any questions regarding the content of the presentation will be addressed at the end. If you would like to download today's presentation, you can do so from the Handouts tab. If you'd like to obtain recertification credits, HRCI and SHRM credits are available to those who attend the live webinar only. The codes will not be available in the playback or on demand of this webinar. We will also be posting a survey at the end of the event and we'll email that to you, so we will appreciate your feedback. Thank you for your patience as I pause for a moment to start a recording. Today's presenters are Chad Albrecht and Steve Marley, both principals at ZS. Chad is a certified sales compensation professional, CSCP, with nearly 20 years of consulting experience. He leads the sales compensation practice, helping clients create and implement motivational sales incentive plans and set fair and challenging sales quotas. Chad focuses primarily on the sales compensation design space for medtech, high-tech, travel, and transportation and manufacturing. Chad has also authored a book, Sales Compensation Solutions and the Future of Sales Compensation, and several articles and publications, including Compensation and Benefits Review, World at Work Journal, and WorkSpan. In addition, he is a regular contributor to The Carrot, the most widely read blog on sales compensation. Chad also speaks frequently at multiple conferences on the topic of sales comp. Steve Marley is the principal in actually ZS's Chicago office. He leads ZS's sales performance management practice and is responsible for incentive compensation management and sales performance management partnerships, implementation, and operations delivery. He focuses on helping companies transition from thinking about monetary incentives to think more holistically about motivation, engagement, and incentives. Steve also has helped companies in a variety of other areas, including territory design, placement, go-to-market strategy, compensation, and sales force effectiveness. So without further ado, I'll hand it on over to Steve Marley.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike, and I appreciate everybody joining the webinar today on behalf of both Chad and myself. For those of you who may not be familiar with ZS, just a little bit of background about our company. We are a global professional services firm that's focused on consulting, analytics, technology, and operations, and you can imagine that those areas dovetail nicely into the world of sales compensation, where plan design and analytics, for example, fall into the analytics and consulting fall into the plan design. Technology falls into the ICM system, operations, selection, and implementation, and our operations work fits nicely with managed services. So we do have a very large sales compensation practice. A number of the areas in which we play. I'm not going to go through all of the content on this slide, but ZS has a very broad scope and scale when it comes to compensation. One thing that I will mention on this slide is the two books, the thumbnails on the right-hand side, on the bottom, The Future of Sales Compensation and Sales Compensation Solutions, were co-authored by Chad and myself. When we wrote The Future of Sales Compensation back in 2016, we were not anticipating a global pandemic. That might be something that we factor into a second edition, but happy to be walking everyone through this webinar today. Now, in terms of the agenda, I'm going to do a brief introduction. I'm going to pass it over to Chad, who will take everyone through the sales comp eligibility, pay level, and mix discussions. I will then cover incentive plan and metrics before turning it back to Chad for a section on quotas. And throughout, please feel free to use the questions panel on the right-hand side. We will leave some time at the end for some Q&A. So with that in mind, let me get started. Just a little bit of background here, how this webinar came to be and how we find ourselves in this situation. So ZS approached the World at Work in late 2019, early 2020 with an idea for a webinar. The original focus that we had was with a super hot economy at some point in time, we are probably going to see a downturn. And how would that affect the way people look at sales compensation? And so we designed the webinar very specifically around the boom and bust cycles that we see in the economy. And then coronavirus and COVID-19 happened. I think that's a fairly common phrase that they came out of the blue to a certain extent in a very short period of time. And as a result, we reshaped this webinar. While the concepts that are being covered around an economic downturn are not necessarily something that are specific to the coronavirus situation, they are certainly things that has caused this to be supercharged and has a lot of focus, a lot of questions, a lot of concerns right now in the industry. And we did repurpose the webinar again for today with that in mind. So happy to have everybody on right now. Now, in terms of what led to this, the webinar, if we think about past economic cycles, there is always a what I would call a bull run followed by a bull bear cycle, and we've enjoyed almost uninterrupted economic growth for the last 10 years. So if we look at the S&P 500 index starting back in 2009, 2010, it's seen almost a 200% increase over that time period. So very strong economic growth. Compensation plans were designed with that growth in mind. And then with the coronavirus situation, we basically lost 30% of those gains in 3 weeks. And the speed of that economic decline has really been record setting. And another way to look at this, that just displays the magnitude of the issue that companies are facing. With credit to Al Gore and an inconvenient truth for this graph, as we look at the rise in new weekly unemployment claims, there was a massive spike in the third week of March, followed by an even bigger spike in the fourth week of March. And so when Chad and I were originally envisioning this webinar, we were picturing a situation where unemployment might spike like it did in 2010. You are in uncharted territories when the growth in unemployment basically puts the last 50 years of unemployment claims into essentially a flatline state. So this really is uncharted territory for a lot of companies. Now, that being said, when we think about how industries have been impacted, there are certain industries I would point to: the airline industry, transportation, hospitality, service industries, that are extremely and significantly impacted. If you look at the United stock price, United Airlines, it dropped over 70% in roughly a month. Now, that's not to say that everyone was impacted to a similar extent. If you think about some of the packaged foods, Campbell's is doing quite well right now. Virtual meetings technologies like Zoom have actually seen an increase in their sales and their stock price. And so one of the things that we look at with Zoom, for example, is there is a growth. While United dropped 70%, Zoom basically went up 135%. And while the purpose of this webinar, I think a lot of people are worried about the economic downturn, I think many of the principles that we've been covering are principles that can be used in many cases in the inverse for periods of economic upturn. And so I will pass it over to Chad to walk us through the next section here. Chad?
Great. Thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone. So we wanted to just start with a picture of a few different scenarios that, depending on your company, depending on your industry, you may see different forms of recovery. So we have of course, the vast majority of industries are suffering now well below their forecast. There are some industries that are projected to recoup a lot of those sales. So for example, some of the elective surgeries that were barred for 2 to 3 months. If you need a new knee now, you'll need it in June or July and August. So there's an expectation that there will be a surge of those elective surgeries, quote unquote elective. Most of them actually need to happen. They can just be time delayed. They might end up in the trajectory A. There are others that might end up in trajectory B. So I can imagine a lot of restaurants, once we're fully reopened, they might go back to where they once were. They're not going to make up for the sales that they lost, but they'll be back on a more steady state trajectory sooner versus later. And of course, there's companies in trajectory C as well that have lost a lot and have no immediate way to recover those losses. So the travel industry, as Steve said, largely falls in Group C. The last prediction I saw said there's no way it can come up to where it was until 2023 or later. Now, these A, B, and C go out to a certain time spot on the horizon. Of course, there could be a reemergence of the virus in the fall. In fact, many are predicting that, which could add even a fourth trajectory, which none of us want, which is a continued delay in the recovery. So with that in mind, we did want to ask our first poll question. And as Mike pulls that up, the question is, which of these trajectories best matches the trajectory you believe your company's on? Of course, nobody can know for sure. But Mike, if you want to pull up that poll, we'll give people the opportunity to answer for their own organization. That'll help Steve and I get a sense for where companies are coming from.
All right, poll is up, everybody. Please select your answer, and then we'll give it about, 10, 15 seconds?
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right. Just a little bit more, a few more seconds. A little over half have voted. Get those last answers in there.
All right, perfect. I think we should be good to publish, Mike, if you want to close it and publish the results.
Okay. Results are now
All
on
right.
your screen.
Okay, great. So the two dominant answers are there are some sales lost. About 41% say we do expect ours to return to the previous run rate sooner rather than later, and 38% don't expect recovery for a long time. So we did craft this webinar with the right audience in mind. 79% do feel that some sales are permanently lost. There are 10% that believe they'll recover most by end of year. That's absolutely terrific. And of course, 12% of that lucky few that are actually in a position where you actually saw an increase, which again, I think is a problem a lot of us would like to have. So let me flip back to the presentation. Mike, if you can do that, and if it's already showing, then great. So I will keep going. One of the things we wanted to look at as we put together this webinar is what have past pandemics look like? If we look at the GDP on a quarterly or annual basis, what happens in the year immediately after the pandemic? And for these four, the Spanish flu, the Asian flu, the Hong Kong flu, and SARS in 2002, they all saw a V-shaped recovery. Of course, that doesn't mean there's a guarantee. Past performance is not a guarantee of future outcomes. But we are hopeful, based on this, that we see more of a V-shaped recovery, at least a quicker recovery than we saw in the 2008-2009 downturn. Okay. So the next poll question, we want to know, what did you do with your Q1 or March sales incentive plan or quota? So Mike, if you want to pull up that second poll.
Poll is up.
And all right. So everybody can see the answer. So for Q2, so that's the current quarter, the options are nothing, just let it ride. The second answer is to pay based on the January, February run rate. So there's some evidence of your success in that limited time. The third option is to guarantee a certain percent of historical payout or target. For those that saw an increase, maybe you captured, accelerated, and then something else. So we'll give a few more seconds here. Like they seem to be landing on a common answer here. So if you want to go ahead and close and publish the polls. So about 2/3 of you say nothing, let it ride. And that could be, we're waiting to see how the end of the quarter turns out. 22% are guaranteeing a certain percent of historical payout. And we see that a lot with, we've done various roundtables in medtech and high tech, and we'll show you some of the results from those roundtables and surveys. But a larger percent of them had already decided on some form of guarantee in the hopes that they can keep their salespeople motivated, engaged, retained when we do actually start to see the V-shaped recovery. So let me keep moving on. Let me talk about sales comp eligibility. Hold on, let me resume slideshow. All right. Okay. So one of the things, and this is a set of slides that we had in our original deck when we weren't focused so much on COVID-19, but we were focused on the overall boom and bust economy. One of the common threads that Steve and I have seen, if you go back to the tech bubble of 2000, 2001, or you go back to the global financial crisis of 08, 09, we saw roles on sales compensation plans that should not have been. So there were roles that support the field, but aren't directly in contact with customers or aren't influencing the purchase decision. Roles like a sales support role or sales assistant, roles that are working with salespeople every day, but aren't accountable for actually delivering the numbers. They're not in communication with the customers every day. And what we find that is it's time like this where these roles, if they were placed on some sort of sales compensation plan, now is the time to consider bringing them back off. So we have a couple of eligibility questions we think about when we think about who should be eligible for a sales compensation plan. And the two eligibility questions are the following. One is, does this role have significant customer interaction? In other words, are they spending at least half their time in communication or interaction with their customers and prospects? Okay, so that's question number one. The second is, does this role persuade the customer to buy our products, to renew our products for account managers, to resell our products if they are working with partners or people in the channel? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, then and only then should this role be on a sales compensation plan. So roles like salespeople, their managers, product specialists, people that are going in and demoing, and their role 100% of the time is sales, then we usually see them on a sales compensation plan. If your answer is no to either of these two questions, then they should be on the corporate plan or the management incentive plan or whatever you want to call it, but they shouldn't be governed by a sales comp plan. So a lot of the roles we saw on the prior page do not belong on sales comp. There are some roles where they might be a little gray, so roles like lead gen, SDR, BDR, roles like that, they are usually on sales comp plans because they do interact with customers the vast majority of their day or prospects. While they may not have the final decision or final influencing on a customer or prospect's willingness to buy, they of course are filling the funnel so that salespeople can close. So there are some gray area, but roles like that we typically see on a sales compensation plan. So what should you do when it comes to sales comp eligibility? The first and foremost is to set up permanent incentive guidelines. So use this opportunity, especially when you have folks that may not really care to be on a sales incentive plan right about now, now is the time to set up those permanent incentive guidelines. And once you do that, you should take those that don't qualify off of sales comp immediately. So take that action now. They'll thank you for it, but make sure we don't get sucked back into a trap of when times are good, we put these support positions on sales comp. When they're not, we take them back off. That doesn't make any sense. All right. So I want to spend just a few minutes on pay level and mix. I know there was a question in the Q&A box about salary. So I am going to talk a little bit about that. This is a survey that World at Work did. It was in March. So, you know, in this day and age with COVID, it's probably outdated because it's a month old. Normally month-old salaries survey results are quite dependable. But in this particular survey, they asked the question whether you plan to, how you plan to move forward with salary increase planning. And between half and 2/3 had said either we've already done it, we've already increased salaries, or we still plan to pay out salary increases in 2020. And then there were two camps that were roughly 20% each. One camp said, no, we're on hold. We're gonna decide later. And then the third said, no, we're canceling our salary increases for 2020. So even back in March, some companies had already decided to cancel. My guess is that number, that graph has shifted from the left-hand column a little bit more to the second and third column as this pandemic continues to dominate the economic news. So one of the things we thought would be useful was to say, okay, companies may not know exactly what they're going to do. What did companies do back in 2009? So the economy absolutely tanked in 2008. So when we surveyed them in 2009, they already knew it was going to be a rough road ahead. So what does that look like? And we may be able to take lessons from that for the current day. So in the high tech, so we did this by industry. So for high tech sales forces, just under 80% said they were going to take some sort of action due to the economic downturn. And the most common action was no increase in base salaries. Almost 2/3 said, we're just going to freeze our base salaries. Another 55% said we're also going to decrease our sales quotas. And then there was a variety of other actions done as well, like freezing our target incentive or eliminating spiffs. The med tech side, so these are companies that make orthopedics, defibrillators, CRM systems, or cardiac rhythm management systems. So about half of them said they were going to take an action. They may have been slightly less impacted than the high-tech firms because they are in healthcare, which tend to be a little bit more immune from downturns in the economy. But there were still over half that took an action, and even for them, the most common action was no increase in salaries, followed by decreased sales quota. So I think that can be telling to where you might see some sales forces and companies make decisions. There was a question in the chat box that I'll just answer now around merit pay for salespeople and whether they give it to them or not. Most companies do. The only time we usually don't see merit pay for salespeople is if your pay mix is, let's say, 50% variable or even more in variable. Because at that point, the merit really just gets drowned out anyway. So it's really not worth doing. All of their pay, an increase in pay is going to be dependent on their variable performance. But most companies, the majority, does still have some type of merit pool for their salespeople. All right, so what do we recommend for this group then? First of all, watch and wait. I would not make any immediate decisions. I think as this plays out, you are going to see more and more companies do whatever it takes to stay in business. Again, depends on the industry you're in. And with staying in business comes reducing your fixed costs, or at least not adding to your fixed costs. And of course, that includes base salary. I think you will see an increased number of companies freezing their base salary, or at a minimum reducing the pool as a way to stay afloat until the economy can get back to what we want it to be. The second is, because we think the pay levels or the increase will change rapidly throughout the next 3 to 6 to 12 months, you may consider increasing your benchmarking frequency. If you did it every 2 years, you may do it every 1 year or even every 6 months, because we do believe that these will change and change rapidly. And then last, whatever you do, focus on keeping your best reps coming out of the bottom of the V. As we head back to a strong economic recovery, focus your decisions on your strongest reps and make sure that you keep them. That should be priority number one in any and all pay level discussion. So I'm going to hand it over to Steve. He's going to walk us through the fourth section, which is what should we do with our incentive plan and metrics?
Great. Thanks, Chad. As Chad mentioned, I'm going to cover incentive plan and metrics, and I've combined these two topics because they tend to be highly interrelated. And what we're going to do in this section is look at a couple of slides that discuss what typically happens during a booming economic cycle. I'll call it the bull market. And then what is the corollary on the bear market side? So what should we be doing, and what are some of the actions that organizations can take during an economic downturn? And when we think about the first case, which is the bull market, a couple of conflicting cursors on here. When we think about the incentive plan design in this time period, there's 4 high-level objectives that companies typically strive for with their incentive plan. It's to motivate their salespeople, to direct their behavior, the right products, the right customers, to reward performance, and then, as Chad mentioned in the previous section, to attract and retain the best talent. Now, when we think about what that means for plan designs, plans and metrics are typically tied very closely to business outcomes, and those business outcomes are usually linked through the incentive plan structure to performance. And what does that typically look like? Well, if you look at a rate table or commission rates or a payout curve, we tend to look at something like what's on the right-hand side, bottom of the screen, an accelerating payout rate structure, an uncapped structure, and we look at that and say, that's highly motivating. And if there's a plan structure that has some sort of regressive component, or the payouts aren't as high, the earning opportunity isn't as high, in periods of economic upturn, that's often deemed to be not motivating. And these are important factors to think about when we have individual metrics really rule the day when it comes to the bull markets. And the people are focused on things like sales units and revenue growth. Now, there's an interesting psychological phenomena that happens during these time periods. It's the concept of internalization. So this isn't to say that there are no team components, or that collaboration isn't important, or that individual metrics are the only things that companies will use. But when there is an uptick, salespeople, sales leaders love to say that the reps are driving all of this performance. It's internal, it's because of them, and therefore we have to reward them. There is a big focus on pay differentiation. Our top performers and our bottom performers are quite different. And those pay mechanisms, the motivating versus the not motivating, tend to come into play. What we've also seen in economic periods where the economy is really hot is that plan designs tend to be all over the place. It's open season. Anything and everything is fair game. We're trying to motivate people. We're trying to engage them. And there's lots of different options that are being bandied about, although surveys have typically shown that commissions and quotas are often popular plan structures and mechanisms. That doesn't necessarily hold true when the economy takes a downturn. So when we're in a bear market, if we think about the strategy that you have to employ, if you are in an organization that has a sales impact that looks something like the chart on the top, the orange line, where there is a small impact or a relatively shallow impact, many of the plan structures that you have in place could continue. Right? So it's something that you might say there's a slight tweak that we need to make here, but we don't need a major overhaul. The challenge really happens in this bottom period where there's a sharp and steep drop off. And part of the challenge is a lot of companies, when they're setting objectives or targets for their salespeople for some period of time in the future, whether that's the next year, the next quarter, whatever it happens to be, you're using some historical baseline. It might be last year's sales. It might be the last 6 months of sales leading into that time period. When you have a sharp drop off, you can imagine that this baseline period, and imagine your baseline period from a time perspective is the start of the shape that says baseline, and it ends when that baseline shape is over. Well, if you're using that baseline, by the time that baseline ends, you can see that the sales have already dropped. So if you're setting quotas, for example, whatever baseline you're using is already invalidated by the time you actually release those quotas. And what's required in this case is some sort of incentive structure to manage through that drop period and manage through the transition period from instability to stability. And the instability period is the drop. The stability period is the flat line. There could be another period of instability on the upside. Chad mentioned a V-shaped recovery. If you're experiencing a V-shaped recovery, the same concept holds true. Your baseline could be underrepresenting what the actual sales are going to turn out to be. Now, when you do have an economic downturn, I think the focus of your plan is a little bit more on short-term pay protection, employee motivation, and fairness. So we're trying to retain the salespeople. We're trying to make sure that they have a living wage that's coming through. That's especially true in highly leveraged plans. And we want people to know that we understand the situation. We're treating them equitably through the process. In terms of a study that we had done, and this one was done after COVID-19 had started to hit, we asked companies if they're changing their Q2 incentive plan as a result. And you can see the big changes here. If you look at the pay better of revising the existing plan or scrap the plan and pay guaranteed amount, those account for almost 70% of the respondents have some degree of guarantee or pay protection that they're bringing into the plans. And that's a marked increase over what they were planning in Q1. In Q1, the primary respondent earlier in the webinar was let it ride. People were letting it ride because the impact of COVID hadn't really manifested itself yet. As we start to work through this instability period, the safest bet for many organizations is to simply provide some guarantee pay at target or put some protections in place until the situation starts to become a little bit more clear. Now, in terms of the metrics, the recommendations here is limit the number of metrics. We've all probably heard that 3 to 4 metrics is the max that you should have in your incentive plan. You might want to ratchet that down to 1 or 2 during these time periods to keep people laser focused. Part of that may be reweighting certain plan components, that if there is something that was very important in the past but is difficult, if not impossible to do in the future, reweighting might be a way to say this is less important right now. The focus shifting from growth often moves to protecting or minimizing losses. So what can we do to minimize the damage in the economic environment? And this might be a time when you consider alternative metrics. And a prime example here is activity-based metrics as a stopgap. I know we wouldn't necessarily, a lot of companies shy away from activity-based metrics. We would say the same thing if there are results in outcome-based performance measures. Those are the better option. But in this case, especially with the COVID situation, this might be your best choice. What we also see in this situation is now there is an externalization. When the economy is hot, salespeople are saying, I'm driving sales. When the economy takes a downturn, the salespeople say it's an external situation. And while I sometimes hear that and take it with a grain of salt. I think we would all agree that this is one of those situations. So what are some of the options? We can aggregate to higher levels. So rather than measuring an individual sales performer, we might be able to lump sales up and pay based on a regional performance, for example. That's a way to still have a sales-based metric, but not penalize somebody who is in a difficult situation. There's also share the pain plans. This might be something where we've seen companies put plans into place where there is some scaling factor based on how well the company is performing or not performing, that the salespeople aren't necessarily going to get full quota relief. If the company's not doing well, the salespeople share some of that burden. The other thing that we often see is this reduction in pay spread. So because there is an externalization, now the top of the payout curve, if I go back to the contrast with the boom cycle, the motivating versus not motivating, when we are externalizing, oftentimes it's okay to reduce the pay spread. We're basically acknowledging that we're not sure of the difference between the top and bottom performers necessarily warrant such a large pay spread. So those are some tweaks that companies could put into the mix. One of the considerations is how long we think this is going to last. So if this was something that was going to last 2 or 3 months, I might recommend a pay at target or some sort of pay protection, and then a return to past metrics. This has all indications of continuing on for a more extended period of time. Some of these plan options at the bottom definitely have a longer time horizon in mind. Now, with that in mind, the last three things I'm going to cover before passing it back to Chad are just some quick case studies, how we've seen organizations manage these types of economic downturns. Not all of these are COVID-19 related, but we worked with an airline company that moved to qualitative measures to focus on activities. So they were in a situation where, and I feel bad for airlines, they've had more than their fair share of economic shocks going back to 9/11 and SARS and the global economic issues in 2008, 2009, and now with the coronavirus. They have seen a massive reduction. In fact, airlines were at the start of the COVID spread, we're seeing net negative bookings, which means that they were seeing more people cancel flights than were booking flights. Difficult to be successful when you have more returns than sales. And who are salespeople going to call on? What customers are going to buy in that environment? Net result is they said we want our salespeople to still be active. We still want them to be involved. There's things that they can do from an account planning and customer relationship perspective. Activity-based metrics are a good stopgap. So they were handling that as part of the COVID situation. The second case study, there was a medtech company. They basically had a product that was recalled. And while this wasn't related to COVID specifically, when you have a recall, that particular product made up a significant proportion of their compensation plan. And they reweighted their plan. So they put more weight on their other products. They said, hey, well, this recall is being worked through. We don't expect a lot of sales. It wasn't reduced to zero. But focus your efforts and energies on these other products that we have in our portfolio. That recall took about a quarter to be handled. Once that was handled, they could promote the product again. It was simply reweighting that product, giving it more emphasis going forward. And so you can see how that could be applied in this situation as well. If your product mix is differentiated, that might be a company that has some mix of products that are technology products that are in demand versus other products that aren't at this point in time. We also had a pharmaceutical company that had a situation where they basically lost their preferred status for one of their drugs in a number of regions. And what that means is doctors and hospitals and healthcare systems would actually not prescribe or not buy their product. They were steered towards one of their competitors. And as you can imagine, there was a very sudden and very sharp drop off. And much like the COVID situation, I think the difference for them is they knew that this had some stability. So once it reached the bottom, there was no expectation of recovery. They basically paid at target for 1 quarter. Once the system stabilized and they had a 3-month baseline of what this lower level of sales was going to look like going forward, they were able to project that and use it for setting new quotas with a lower baseline going forward. So after about a quarter, 2 quarters, they were able to shift back to their old plan by putting this protection in place. So a lot of these concepts companies have been using when they've had economic shocks or downturns. They're not specific to COVID, but certainly relevant in today's environment. And I am going to pass it to Chad now, and Chad can walk us through the final section on quotas.
Very good. And if you do have questions, we'll be addressing them here in just a few minutes, so feel free to put them in the Q&A tab. Before we go to quotas, I do want to get a sense for what you have done with your Q2 quotas. So, excuse me, Mike, if you're able to pull up that poll. I know we asked, what are you doing with your sales compensation plan? This is related but different. The options are do nothing. We're going to stick with the original. The second is we didn't even try to set them. We're just going to set some sort of guarantee or floor because it's too unpredictable right now. Third is reduce quotas. The fourth is wait and see. And the fifth is something else. So take a few more seconds and submit your answer. All right. So Mike, if you want to go ahead and publish the poll. So what it's showing is that the majority is saying nothing, stick with the original quotas, followed by waiting until the economy becomes clear. And interestingly, as I was watching the poll numbers move, a lot of people shifted from nothing, stick with the original quotas, to wait until the economy becomes clear, meaning while we haven't done anything yet, we're not forgetting or we're still leaving open the possibility that we're going to do something. I think only 13% have reduced quotas. I think for most organizations, it's just a fool's errand to try and predict where you're going to end up, even at the end of Q2, say nothing about the end of the year. So one of the things that we did in the most recent survey, which was during COVID-19, it was just published last week. So we asked, what did you do not just in Q1, but also in Q2? And if you look at the results from this, while hardly anybody changed anything for Q1, there's a lot of uncertainty about Q2. So 2/3 of the people, if you look at the pie chart on the far left, said this had some impact on us, the quota. So it's going to impact what we do with quotas. For Q2 in particular, a third of folks are undecided. Another third of folks said we're not going to even try to set quotas, and then the rest of the answers were all across the board. So there's really a lot of variety in terms of how people are handling Q2 quota. So what's our recommendation? Definitely take this on a month-by-month basis. And things change on a week-by-week basis. So trying to do quotas beyond Q2 is likely not going to be particularly helpful. While we normally look to a much longer planning horizon, it's just the reality of this virus. We need to do it month by month. We don't know where the hotspots are going to pop up. You might have to start to geographically differentiate where you can and can't set quotas, and those will be done on a month-by-month basis for the most part. The second is be vigilant, meaning don't just, much like people that are ignoring the stay-at-home orders think, okay, the worst is past, we can go out and play on the beach. Don't think that your company is ready to set quotas because the worst is behind us. This thing is going to spike at different geographies and at different places, and all indicators are that we'll have a second resurgence in the fall. So be vigilant and don't just assume we have it licked and therefore I can set quotas. And the third point is a really important point, and it actually relates to one of the questions that came in, which is around be wary or be cognizant of the look when you have certain sales employees being guaranteed a certain percent of their pay, whereas there may be no communication that has gone out to all employees. That might start to begin to look like some sort of favoritism. And while the sales employees should, if you're going to do some sort of floor guarantee for all your employees, think about it in terms of your target total comp. So when we've done 4 roundtables now at various industries, most are guaranteeing target total comp somewhere in the 70 to 90% of target total comp range for salespeople. I would say that's probably the middle 50% in terms of where people are guaranteeing their pay. So because salespeople are so highly leveraged in many cases, that just means a much higher proportion of their variable pay is being guaranteed versus somebody on the corporate plan that has maybe 10% of their salary at risk, for instance. So you should absolutely look at the sales and non-sales together when you're thinking about the total comp and how much you are or are not willing to guarantee. So with that, we are going to open it up to questions. And Mike, I will turn it back over to you so you can moderate the questions that come in and fire away.
Thank you. Was the survey done before COVID-19?
Yeah, the ones we talked about were done before COVID-19. The World at Work one that we referenced was done maybe just a week or 2 in. So that was late March. So yes, it was done during COVID-19. I suspect those have changed. But the ones that we showed, the most recent surveys, were in fact done just last week, as a matter of fact.
Thank you. For pay protection, do you think it should depend on the pay mix? Like for some selling roles, their fix can be 80% to 90% of total cash, whereas some selling roles fix is about 50 to 60%. Should the level of protection be different? Or what is the overall percentage of protection in terms of total cash that you're recommending?
Yeah, and that gets back to the sales versus non-sales argument around which one should they be treated the same. I don't think they should be treated the same, but the general message should be the same, meaning we're all going to sacrifice here. Executive salaries should be sacrificed. The management incentive company bonus should be sacrificed. The sales comp should be sacrificed. Everybody should have some stake in the game. The problem is when you start to compare and say, well, you guaranteed half of the salesperson's variable pay, but you're not guaranteeing half of my management bonus. Well, that's not fair. Well, it might be fair because the salesperson, I guarantee you, is going to take a much bigger haircut than the standard employee. So they need to be aligned, but not identical is what I would say. Everybody needs to absorb part of the pain from executives on down to everybody down in the field.
Thank you. I think you might have already answered this, but have a question on merit increase. How prevalent are they for salespeople?
Yeah, we did briefly cover off on that. I don't know. I don't have a percent top of mind. My guess is maybe 2/3 to 3/4 have some sort of merit increase for their salespeople. Again, I don't have that benchmark top of mind. When you are more heavily leveraged, like if you're 50-50 mix, meaning half your pay is coming in base, half your pay is coming in incentive, it's probably not worth trying to even have a merit pay, because if a 3% merit pay on only half of your total comp is really not going to amount to anything in comparison to what they could earn on the variable side by overachieving their goal. So if you have half or more of your pay in salary, then as a general rule, you should still have some sort of merit pay attached to your salary.
To what extent should changes to a company's sales compensation plan be in alignment with the overall corporate plan? Like, for example, if no changes are planned to the corporate plan, which impacts far more people than the sales comp plan, is it fair or right to change the sales comp plan?
Yeah, and I think I would go back to the answer I gave to the earlier question around alignment, meaning if you're saying we're going to let the management incentive plan ride, and that means the majority of people who might lose their 10% bonus, if you were to say let the sales compensation plan ride, that could very well mean most people losing half their pay. And while some organizations are absolutely doing that, particularly the cash-strapped ones, the many are not, because if a salesperson loses half their pay, that could cause them to not be able to pay their mortgage, and they might be actively looking for another job that may not be as hard hit. So I would just be a little bit careful with identical policies. They should be aligned and consistent, but not identical.
How can you retain your best reps? Will you differentiate between reps?
So I would. I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all for retention. So the best way I've seen companies do that is rather than guaranteeing a percent of target. So let's say a firm said we're going to guarantee 90% of your target. For me, a better way to retain your best reps is to not just give everybody the same 90% of target. It's let's look at your last 4 quarters of earnings. That's what we're going to guarantee for you. So if you were one of our best reps, that is going to show up in your last 4 quarters earnings. So therefore, when I change the policy or the practice to guarantee 90% of last 4 quarters earnings, I am inherently treating the historically high performers better than everybody else. And as a general rule, I support that proposition.
Yeah, I just wanted to build off of that as well, because one of the recommendations I would have is determining and having an approach to define your best salespeople, especially in an uncertain economic environment. I think a lot of times people will look at past sales, but as you start to reach, and maybe some sales are still coming in. Chad had mentioned before as well, as various states are reopening at different times, you might see sales increases in a Texas or a Georgia, for example, but not in Illinois. And does that mean if your Illinois salesperson isn't seeing sales, that your Texas rep is better? That's a situation where you might need to look at the economic situation and understand what's happening on a state-by-state basis, and look at the historical performance of those folks. Look at whatever metrics you use internally to define your best salespeople and use that as a baseline, because I think information that is going to come through in the middle of the pandemic is probably not going to be particularly accurate for making that type of determination.
All right, next question. With the store closures in the retail sector, we are developing key opinion leaders internally and starting live stream and online sales with our followers. Could you give us some insights on what kind of incentives should we give for such an online sales, whether it should go by incentive per live event or sales commission, or any other better ideas you would recommend?
Steve, you want to take that, or you want me to grab it?
I'll start. You can definitely chime in. One of the, I don't know if I have a specific recommendation for that situation. It sounds like it's a little bit like inside sales. And if you can attribute some sort of purchasing or some sort of buyer behavior or customer behavior to those events, then that's certainly what I would recommend paying on. As we think about activity-based or MBOs that are in compensation plans, we typically say, look, you start on the far right with sales, and if you don't have sales, you start walking your way back to the left, and what is the activity that drives that sale, and are they doing that in these live events? So can you measure that even if it's not leading to an immediate purchase? If not, you go back and you work your way back from the actual sales outcome to something that is more activity based on the left hand side. So as you work from right to left, your metric and what you can pay people on and how you can reward people should be based on what can you quantify, what can you track that they're doing, right? Is it sufficient to just say I hosted a live event? Or is there a certain type of live event? Is there a certain measure of effectiveness of that live event that would make a better incentive metric? And so that might be something that we could take offline. It sounds like there might be a specific situation that you have, but Chad, I'll pass it to you to see what you would add there as well.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is just being, so I agree with everything you said, and if we think this particular role is driving results, then pay on results. The one caveat being, it sounds like this is a very new channel, and with very new channels, it's really impossible to accurately forecast results. So if there is concern that sales could be X, they could be 10X, you just need to be a bit careful in how you set up that commission plan or whatever it is, so that you're not overpaying simply because, or underpaying, simply because we just had no idea what to expect in terms of revenue. So I absolutely agree with Steve on paying with results. Just keep in mind you might have to have a little bit different incentive in your first month or quarter than you will in the long term, just because it'll be impossible to accurately predict what that platform might bring in terms of revenue or sales.
All right, it looks like we're coming up on the closing moments. Any last or parting commentary before we close out today?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just make sure you retain your best reps. We will come out of this, I believe strongly in a V, whether that's later this year, more likely next year. So I would focus on minimizing your salary costs and focusing on and sending your best reps to come shooting out of this next year with a V-shaped recovery.
Thank you, Chad and Steve, for sharing your knowledge and time with us. This webinar will be available for playback for up to 90 days. Just simply log into your worldatwork.org website and access your profile. The HRCI and SHRM codes will be available momentarily, as I will have to share my screen. I will be stopping recording now.